Thank you all. Thank you for joining today. Really appreciate it, and I hope everyone's enjoying the conference so far. I've been fascinated by so many of the talks, and really appreciate the diverse perspectives and the great topics that we have. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the current state of ransomware, specifically how it impacts municipalities and state and local governments, and kind of things you can do to hopefully protect your organization from that. Got a bunch of slides here, take about 35 minutes to go through, or about 25 minutes to go through, and we'll leave some time at the end for questions. Zainab's been here and she's been really good and hopefully she'll help get us through this quickly, and I definitely want, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. So this is a little bit about me. I'm an intelligence analyst at Recorded Future. I research ransomware attacks and campaigns, which who knew when I was 10 that was actually going to be a job you could have. And I advise clients on how to protect themselves. This is my contact information. You can also reach me on Twitter at Allan, UUALLAN. Happy to answer any questions even after this conference if anybody has them. So let's talk about a quick brief history of ransomware. Most people don't know the first ransomware attack was in 1989. The first computer ransomware attack was in 1989, known as the AIDS Trojan. And there were several attempts prior to 2013 to launch ransomware attacks. But the problem with most of those is they required you to either, as in the case of the AIDS Trojan, mail a check or use Western Union or MoneyPack or something like that to pay the ransom. Those are all ways of paying funds that can be reversed. In 2008, the Bitcoin white paper was published, and in 2012 or so, Bitcoin became more popularly used. And unfortunately, with that came the explosion of ransomware. So starting in, say, 2013, all the way up through 2020, we've seen an explosive growth in ransomware. And we've also seen a change in tactics over time. So when ransomware first came out, it was generally like a lot of, it was considered kind of commodity malware. You had, it was mass delivered to a whole lot of people, generally with the ransomware actors demanding ransoms in the range of, $300, $500, maybe $1,200. But starting in 2018, we really have seen ransomware actors switched from targeting customers to targeting organizations. It actually kind of started in 2017, but we won't quibble too much about dates. Companies, healthcare providers, state and local governments are now preferred targets. We often refer to them as big game hunting. And many ransomware cyber criminals, as I'm sure everyone's aware, are getting into the extortion game, also called double extortion. So they threaten to release files if you don't pay the ransom. Now, with the popularity of big game hunting, so with ransomware threat actors going after bigger targets, the ransom demands have been on the rise. More ransomware actors move to these profitable targets, they can extort more money from victims. So according to Coveware, the average ransom payment in the first quarter of 2020 was $111,605. That was the average payment. The average ransom demand was actually much higher, but most victims negotiate down the ransom from what's demanded to what's paid. But even that was a 33% increase from the fourth quarter of 2019, and those numbers are going up pretty dramatically every quarter in terms of the average payment size. So ransom demands are getting bigger. The targets are getting bigger. You see ransomware threat actors going after publicly traded companies, going after utilities, going after hospitals, etc. And again, we talked about extortion already. These are just some of the ransomware campaigns that are targeting, that are using the double extortion, demanding money from victims that don't pay, or they'll publish all of their sensitive files. These are the ones that have the most notoriety because they have multiple victims and they have pretty well-established websites that have all of that information in them, so anybody can check to see who's been a victim of this ransomware and who hasn't paid the ransom. In addition to the growth in targeting, we also have the growth of ransomware as a service. Ransomware as a service offerings allow attackers to pay an upfront fee. Novice attackers gain an upfront fee to gain access to ransomware. Seller gives the affiliated executable, and affiliate is their term, not mine. Basically, ransomware as a service is like multi-level marketing for bad guys, including the fact that, just like in most multi-level marketing, most of the affiliates don't make as much money as the main actors. Seller takes, so you give them money, the affiliate an executable, they pay for that executable, and then the seller takes a cut of all collected ransom, somewhere between 20 and 40%. Most of these services offered for sale on underground forums like dark web markets, although some are sold on Twitter and YouTube. You can Google those. The ones that are on Twitter and YouTube just are awful. We've never seen an infection from them, but it's fun to watch their videos and other things. The growth of RAS offerings, though, has helped to accelerate ransomware attacks. So if you think about it, in 2015 and 16, there were maybe a dozen different ransomware families out there. And so you had a dozen different groups delivering that ransomware. So they would hit a lot of targets, but they were limited by the fact that there were only a dozen or so groups. In 2020, there are still only a dozen ransomware families you need to worry about. There are hundreds of ransomware families. Most of them suck. Most of them don't ever actually infect anybody. Or they infect very few. So they're not really a huge concern. There are a dozen or so that are a real concern. The difference is now you have hundreds of threat actors delivering that ransomware, which makes it a much bigger threat, which is why it seems like every day there's a new story of somebody being hit with ransomware, because there is, and there are now much bigger targets getting hit. And ransomware, the ransomware as a service accounts for a lot of the money that we see changing hands through ransomware attacks. So this is a look at from a presentation the FBI did at the most recent RSA, so RSA 2020, back when we could actually go to conferences in person. All of the ransomware that's circled in red are known ransomware as a service. And this is only accounts through roughly the first half of 2019 in terms of money made. And so, as you can see, out of the top 10 there, 4 of them are ransomware as a service offerings. And if you were to rerun that number now, you'd actually see more. And there's some others like BitPaymer and Dharma that may have that may be operating as a ransomware as a service, because it looks like there are multiple versions of that. We just haven't found evidence of an affiliate program yet. Now, who are they going after? So state and local governments have been a bellwether for ransomware attacks. There's some of the earliest targets, and they continue to be a target. But there's been a noticeable acceleration in the last couple of years as ransomware actors are focusing their attention on state and local governments. And that's because they get attention when they're successful, they get paid a lot more money, and they can brag about it. So we saw that in 2018, there were 55 publicly reported attacks. There were over 100 through the end of 2019. It was like 110. Before the pandemic hit, 2020 was on track to blow that number away. It still may wind up doing that. What we're seeing is there are actually a lot of ransomware attacks that have happened against state and local governments. It's just with so much staff being furloughed and staff not going in, we're finding that a whole lot of towns and cities didn't know they were hit with ransomware until they start going back in. And so we're seeing an uptick in reporting, but we don't know how long those incidents are. And more importantly, ransomware actors often use government payouts, such as those from the Lake City and River. So by going against the state and local governments, you'll be able to pull in a lot of money, even if their ransomware wasn't the one that was used in those attacks. It doesn't matter. They're still using them as a selling point. But it's not just state and local governments. Healthcare has been hit really hard. Manufacturing's been really hit really hard. Law firms have been hit really hard. There are a number of industries that have been hit pretty dramatically by these ransomware attacks across multiple industry. In particular, in Canada, healthcare providers in Canada have been hit very hard. So the Gippsland Health Alliance has been hit. Ontario hospitals have been hit. The Child Welfare Agency in Southern First Nations was hit. eHealth was hit. And we're seeing more and more attempted attacks on healthcare providers in Canada. So that number is continuing to grow. And despite what you may have heard, ransomware threat actors are accelerating their attacks on healthcare providers during the pandemic. And the reason is they know that patient care is a priority, and they know that healthcare providers will do anything they can to get patient services back up and running, even if that means paying the ransom. That also means that the ransomware threat actors, as you might suspect, are complete bastards. So let's switch and talk a little bit about the kind of tactics that we're seeing right now. So one, we're seeing a rise in the use of remote access services. So for the longest time, ransomware was primarily the domain of phishing attacks. Phishing attacks are very effective, and they still make up a large percentage of that. But as you can see, according to F-Secure in the second half of 2019, phishing attacks only accounted for 24% of ransomware attacks, whereas manually installed, which is generally remote access services, accounted for 28%. So in basically all of 2019, remote access services outpaced phishing as a primary form of attack. And one of the reasons for that is many of these exposed systems administrators don't even know about. So you may have an open remote desktop server that you're not aware of. You may have an exposed Citrix server you're not aware is exposed, so you don't have it in line to be patched or anything like that. And so the ransomware actors are constantly scanning for those, looking for that access. Now, if you combine obviously phishing and remote access services, that accounts for about 52%. The other things that we see a lot of, software cracks are a big one. Exploit kits and malvertising, that's basically a web ad with something in it, and vulnerably compromised firmware and middleware. And this trend is continuing in 2020 as well. So this is over the last 6 months, just some of the examples. We saw that Soda Nakibi is targeting Pulse Secure. Remote desktop protocol is often used. Citrix servers are being used, etc. So these are just some examples of some of the attacks we've seen just in the last 6 months. With so much of the workforce now working from home, we've definitely seen an acceleration in attacks focusing on remote access services. So that means that that's a big area where, if you're a defender, you absolutely want to focus on protecting those. Phishing, again, just because it's not as common, is still a important part of ransomware attacks. We see a lot of COVID-19 themed lures, and we were seeing a lot of success with those. That's dropped off a lot, but then threat actors have moved from COVID-19 themed lures to stimulus and refund and loans and things like that. So people that are expecting government stimulus check, or that are expecting loans, or expecting tax relief, or whatever it is, we're seeing a lot of themes built around that right now, which are seeing a lot of success. But at one point, the Emotet trick bot, which is often used to deliver the Ryuk ransomware, their COVID-19 themed phishing lures, we're seeing a 10% click-through rate. And most marketing companies would love a 10% click-through rate, much less a phishing campaign. So they were seeing a lot of success with that. There no new tactics there. It was just basically a recovering of their existing tactics with a pretty new theme. The other thing that we're seeing growth in is fileless ransomware. So fileless ransomware is a little bit of a misnomer, but NetWalker ransomware, which is used against healthcare providers in Spain, Australia, Canada, the United States, have switched to kind of a fileless mode. And when we say fileless, we don't mean that there's no file. What we mean is they don't use a portable executable, which is relatively easy to detect. Instead, they rely on PowerShell and reflective DLL loading, so they're not downloading DLLs, they're not downloading files. It's you get a phishing email, in that embedded in that phishing email is a PowerShell script. That PowerShell script then does everything. And once the system's prepped for a ransomware attack, they will, then they'll download the executable, but not until then. That allows them to bypass a lot of the security. So, and this is from Trend Micro, has a great blog on this. I highly recommend reading it. This will basically let you run through which, this basically walks through the process of what that fileless ransomware looks like and how it works. Another thing we're seeing that's new is the use of Evil Clippy. Evil Clippy is a red team tool. So it was developed by companies for penetration testing, and it's used to create Trojanized Microsoft Office documents. And it is really good at avoiding detection, which is why it's used by a lot of red teams, but unfortunately bad guys use it as well. In a most recent example, basically what the threat actor did is they would load an Office document with a benign macro, so that when it went through the mail server, when it went through whatever other detections that the organization had in place, it would pass all of those detections because the macro is completely benign at rest. When it was finally opened on the desktop, what it would do is it would reach out to command and control server. It would pull down the malicious binary, pull down the malicious macro, embed that in the document, and then run that malicious document on the desktop, or that malicious macro on the desktop. So what it's doing is, again, bypassing all of your security systems that are in place and only executing the bad thing when it's time to actually install the ransomware. And then we've seen the bad guys behind Ragnarok using VirtualBox to disguise their activity. So VirtualBox is a freely available virtual machine, so kind of like VMware and so on. And basically, what they're doing is when they gain access through whatever loader system they gain access, when they finally have access into the network, what they do is they, when they're ready to deploy the ransomware, they instead of just delivering an executable, they actually use the virtual machine. So they install the virtual machine and then map the drives, the local drives and any network drives they can get their hands onto that virtual machine. And from the virtual machine, they execute the ransomware. Again, that bypasses your antivirus program, and it allows them to encrypt all of the files on those map drives and the map locals drive. So they get to avoid detection by traditional security tools, and they install the ransomware on as many systems as possible. Again, Sophos has a really good blog on this. I highly recommend reading that. You can get more details about how that has worked. So all of this seems really bad, and it is, but there are things that you can do to protect your organization. We're going to start with the obvious backups. That's sort of been the mantra from the start with ransomware. You need to have good backups. Now, the problem with the advent of the double extortion is that the problem with that is that even if you have good backups, it doesn't matter because all of your files are out on the internet. So ideally, while good backups are important, if you're hit with one of the ransomware that's doing extortion, you want to stop it before they have a chance to steal your files. And that starts by keeping them out. So ransomware actors are targeting remote work tools. You want to make sure you're prioritizing patching of any of those systems that are exposed. when you're scanning your network, you want to make sure you're thinking like an attacker, like you want to scan for any systems that maybe you don't know about, make sure those get patched. Conduct regular phishing exercises using the latest lures. So you don't want to use something from 5 years ago. You want to make sure you're staying current with what the bad guys are using. But we all know that phishing training fails. No matter how often you do it, there's always somebody that no matter what you do, they always are willing to click that file. If you can, disable macros in Microsoft Office globally. I'm a little biased. I just don't like anybody that uses macros in Microsoft Office documents. So as far as I'm concerned, disable it globally. I realize that there are probably some legitimate uses for it. I don't know what they could possibly be. So disable macros globally using GPO, but enable them selectively for people who actually claim they need it. And remember, the average cost of a ransomware payment is $111,000. That's just for the payment. That doesn't account for everything else that you have to spend to fix your system. So when somebody says they really need macros, ask them if it's worth $111,000 in order to in order for them to have macros, plus the $2 million or so it may cost you in other fees. And then disable PowerShells on workstations that don't need it, which should be all of them. Your administrators probably need PowerShell on their workstation, but they can do everything they need to do with a remote PowerShell, from the Active Directory server or someplace like that. So if you can disable PowerShell locally and just have them run their scripts from a server that does have it enabled, that will keep, even if your phishing training doesn't work, that should keep the bad guys from being able to execute PowerShell on the desktop. You want to stop data from leaving your network, because that is a problem you need to concern about. A lot of the ransomware threat actors reuse the same infrastructure for exfiltrating data, for taking data out of the network. Good idea to find those IP addresses if you can. They're usually pretty readily available on the internet. You want to find those IP addresses and you want to block them. Just straight up block them if you can. If you can't block them for whatever reason, at least monitoring your SIM for large file transfers to those files. The good news is the bad guys aren't being subtle about it. They will just, terabytes worth of data all at once. They do tend to work on the weekends and at odd hours, at least if you're East Coast in Canada or the US. It tends to be kind of odd hours that they're working. So you can, narrow it down by looking for that. I like the use of honey files as well. So honey files are files that you load onto your system with a bait name, basically. Now, in this case, you don't always, the name doesn't really matter. You just want to put it in a directory where files will be stolen, because if that file is ever accessed, and again, it should never be accessed by a human, you can create an alert that says, hey, this file's been accessed. I need to go ahead and stop whatever's going on. So you need to be able to stop that process. And then finally, I highly recommend regular threat hunting missions. Threat hunting missions are kind of a big deal in that now that with the big game hunting ransomware, the threat actors are in your network for a while. It takes a while. It takes, at least by FireEye measurements, it takes at least 3 days and often a couple of weeks from when they initially land in the network to be able to learn the network, get where they need to get, and steal all the data from your network. That means that they're in there for a while, and you have a chance to stop them before they have a chance to deploy their ransomware. So what you want to do is you want to use regular threat hunting missions to look for TTPs associated with ransomware and ransomware threat groups. But in order for threat hunting to be effective, your team has to be nimble and be able to act with autonomy. So if they see something bad, they need to be able to stop it right away, because that's the only way threat hunting works effectively. Again, I really appreciate everybody's time. We've got about 5 minutes, and I'd love to answer any questions that you all have. Thank you very much. Hopefully, you're going to enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, Allan. We actually do have quite a few questions that have come through.
Okay.
I will just go with these in the order that they've come through.
Okay.
I'm not an expert in reordering questions. Here we go. So the first one that's come through is, what percentage of companies actually decide to pay a ransom demand as opposed to scrambling to effect backups or just letting the data slide?
So interestingly, that number depends on the industry. So like healthcare's got a higher percentage, whereas like state and local governments actually have a lower percentage that actually pay the ransom. We don't have good numbers because most people don't report their ransomware attack. Most of them kind of slip it under the rug, especially if they get hit, they pay, they recover, and nobody notices. It's when somebody notices that it comes out, when you start seeing tweets saying, hey, I can't pay my water bill, or I can't make an appointment at this hospital. That's when everybody knows that, hey, something happened to this to this organization, and reporters start sniffing around, and we find out there was actually a ransomware attack. So the estimates vary greatly. Somewhere between 20% and 65% actually pay the ransom. That's a really broad number. And it depends on who you ask. Coveware has some statistics on it. Symantec has some statistics on it. McAfee has some statistics on it. And the numbers all vary greatly. So I'd hate to give a definitive answer because I don't think there is one.
Perfect. Are ransomware attacks, or could they be indirectly state-sponsored due to political tensions and the news that we're seeing?
Absolutely. We know, for example, WannaCry was a nation-backed attack. NotPetya was a nation-backed ransomware attack. So we do know that ransomware, some nation states are using ransomware as either a distraction, or in the case of like North Korea, which kind of intermingles state-sponsored goals with cyber criminal goals, and they do both. So North Korea, for example, will do regular state-sponsored operations, but they'll also do ransomware operations because they need money. So yes, it's definitely state-sponsored as well as cyber criminal.
With hackers shifting focus to things like healthcare, smart cities, even non-for-profits, what are the best immediate steps to take to ensure protection from such threat agents?
I know you think I'm going to be joking, but I'm not. And I know it's not a practical solution, but the best way to protect yourself from getting hit by ransomware is to change your the language pack to Russian, and your keyboard layout to Cyrillic. Most ransomware operators work out of not Russia, but Russia's locus of control. So think Estonia and the other Baltic states. And they have very strict rules about attacking people in Russia. So they have safeties built into their ransomware so that they won't target computers that have the Russian language pack, that are running the Russian language pack, and that have a Cyrillic keyboard layout. Russian Cyrillic, not Ukrainian Cyrillic. It's okay to go after people in Ukraine. So really weird. That is a very effective way to stop a ransomware attack. It's not a very practical solution. But in reality, the biggest thing to do is just the fundamentals. Make sure you're patching any systems that are exposed to the internet. Make sure you're conducting good phishing awareness training, and then lock down your systems as much as possible. Don't give access that you don't have to give. Make it harder for when they get in. If they can't get admin access to a system, then it's much harder for them to do their job.
Perfect. So we have 3 more questions here. Guys, I see questions are still being typed in. Any questions beyond the 3 that I have here, you can definitely go to the recorded future booth and interface with the team there that'll be able to answer any further questions. So we'll just do these, we'll wrap up with these last 3. Okay. So Allan, this one is, how does ransomware still happen when every security vendor says they can stop it?
Well, so a lot of it honestly is there's a sort of a haves and have nots, right? Yes, if you're running, FireEye at the edge, if you're running Carbon Black on all the desktops, and and you have wireless and you have WAFs and other things in there, it's going to be very hard for a ransomware threat actor to get through. Most organizations don't have the budget to do that. Most organizations, even if they do have some of the budget, can't actually enable all of the features. It's too much of a load on the machines or something like that. One thing I do recommend to people, you have vendors that you have relationships with. You have security vendors you have relationships with. Bring them in and say, look, we want to make sure we're prepared for a ransomware attack. We don't want to spend any more money. Tell us what features we should be enabling in your product to best protect us against ransomware. Let them kind of guide you through what needs to be done, right? Because you're absolutely right. They will all tell you, recorded feature included, will tell you we can help you prevent ransomware attacks. You have to know what features you need to enable, what you need to be doing in order to get that capability. So you want to have those vendors come in. Ideally, once everything reopens, have them buy you lunch or bring lunch in when they do it. But you want to have that conversation with them. What do I need to enable? Not going to give them any more money. What you're already paying for, you want to make sure you're getting the most out of it.
Perfect. We have, what if ransomware has already encrypted a bunch of files before it reaches a honey file? In other words, what are the best places to plant honey files and false positives?
It's a good question. Most ransomware threat actors start on your file server. So plant your honey files on your file server, ideally in a really nice, fancy directory. If you really want to go crazy, create a fake server called file server, put your real server somewhere else, your real files somewhere else, because that is what the bad guys are going to look for. They don't know your network. Sometimes you don't know your network, but they don't know your network very well. They're trying to figure it out. If they see an easy thing, oh, this is the file server, great. And there's a whole bunch of files in there, including a bunch with password names on them and social security number information and so on, all in the subject line. They're going to target that first and pull that out because they want to get the juicy stuff out of the network first. So again, now I want to be clear, honey files and honey servers and all that are really cool and they're really fun and they can do a lot to stop a ransomware attack, but you do need to have the basics in place first. If you're not detecting when that honey file or honey server's accessed and you're not able to react immediately, then it's not doing you any good. So that is the same thing with, okay, even if you were to place it in, a directory in somebody's workstation, you have to be able to react immediately when that's happened, ideally through automation using swim lane or Phantom or something like that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Allan. So I'll give it to you for closing remarks.
Thank you all again very much. I really appreciate it. This has been a really good conference, and I want to really thank the organizers of siberX and thank you for all of your help. And you have my email address. If there are any other questions that you didn't get an answer to, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to help.
Thank you so much, Allan. I've also dropped Allan's Twitter handle in the chat there. You can follow him and ask him any questions you have. It's at UUAllan, ALLAN. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. Thanks, Allan.
Thank you.